of social media before we get started. For those of you who are crossing paths with us for the first time, the Observatory on Social Media, or as the acronym is pronounced, OSoMe, is a joint project between the Luddy School of Informatics, Computing and Engineering and the Media School at Indiana University. OSoMe is an interdisciplinary research group that is interested in all things at the intersection of media and technology with a specific focus on social media. We conduct rigorous research, build analytic tools and software for both scientists and journalists, and hope to educate the next generation of computationally skilled media folks. For more details on our latest work, please do check out our link, which is there at the bottom of the screen, which is osome.iu.edu. As part of the observatory's interdisciplinary mission, we organize this OSoMe Speakers virtual event. This event aims to provide a platform for leading scholars and researchers to share their work and insights about social media, manipulation, and misinformation across some topics like that. The attempt is to bring together experts from various fields to discuss a large range of topics related to information integrity. Please do check out our event page for future events and recordings from the previous talks. And with that, it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker for today, Professor Patrick Warren. Patrick Warren is a professor of economics and the co-director of Media Forensics Hub at Clemson University. Before coming to Clemson, he studied at MIT, earning a PhD in economics and an undergraduate degree from South Carolina Honors College. His research investigates how organizations interact with information environments at for-profit, non-profit firms, bureaucracies, political parties, and even armies. He has written numerous peer-reviewed articles in the top economics, political science, communication, and law journals. He has served on the board of the Society for Institutional and Organizational Economics, has been a visiting associate professor at Northwestern University, and a visiting scholar at the RAND Corporation. So before we begin, I'll just like to lay out the structure for today. We'll have 40 to 45 minutes of presentation by Dr. Warren, followed by 15 minutes of questions. Feel free to put your questions in the chat, but we encourage that you ask questions at the end so that we can have like a really interesting conversation. And with that, I'd like to invite Dr. Warren to kick off this term's speaker series. Let's give him a little bit of a Zoom clap.
Well, thanks a lot, Rasika and Caitlin and the whole crew for inviting me today. I'm a long-time fan of the work you all do at OSoMe. I've used your tools many times. I've interacted with many of your great faculty and students, and so it's awesome to be here at OSoMe and share what we've been working on at the Hub. And hopefully this can be the start of a conversation about other ways that the Hub and OSoMe can collaborate. So what I want to talk to you about today is some work that's joint with a couple other people at Clemson, actually. Darren Linville, my co-director at the Hub, and Camille Saucier, who is assistant professor in the communications department. She's a Knight Fellow, not a Knight Fellow. She's a Hub affiliate and is funded under the Big Knight grant that we got a few years back. And so she's been great at Clemson, and I think she's really contributed in substantial ways to this paper and what we have going on. So this is really a case study, but I hope this case study is useful in terms of, I don't know, maybe resetting or broadening the way we might want to think about evaluating the impact of the sort of thing that many of us here, I think, care about, which is kind of inauthentic, coordinated, often state-sponsored influence operations. And the particular case study that I want to talk about today is a case study involving a particular Russian actor known as Storm 1516. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the campaign more broadly, this narrative laundering campaign that they've been involved with. But I want to narrowly focus on the elements of that campaign that targeted Vladimir Zelensky. So if you've seen any of the messaging from this campaign, you've seen this. This is a tweet from Tara Reid. Tara Reid is, an American who no longer lives in America and spreads a lot of Russian related narratives. And here's her, just as an example of influencer on X sharing this narrative, which is that Vladimir Zelensky owns two yachts worth $75 million, and you should go and read this story in DC Weekly. .org that lays out all of the documents that suggest that he owns this yacht, and there may also be an interview, and there may also be, eyewitness accounts of him selling the yachts and things like that. This was one particular narrative that was introduced by Storm 1516 in November of 2023. So actually, it was 2 years ago now. That had some substantial take up. And on the right of this slide here, you can see some examples of that take up. So two top House Republicans say some of their GOP colleagues are parroting Russian narratives on Ukraine. Here are some examples. So several members of Congress mentioned this story, both in the positive and in the debunking. And probably the most prominent person to mention this story was J.D. Vance. So J.D. Vance cited on Steve Bannon, is it real? Should we really be sending money to Ukraine? I worry that that money would just be used to buy a bigger yacht. And so that's like quite a specific reference to be making kind of just in passing right after this campaign came out. And so this is some examples of, how something that started on Twitter, and I'll talk a little bit about how it gets started, can insert itself into the broader cultural zeitgeist. And you should think about this sort of narrative when I'm going through my examples, because it has some nice features for us, so econometrically, in order to try to see if we can track the way this narrative moves, because it's so very specific. As I'll show you, no one used the words Zelensky and yacht together until this narrative was released, and then there were substantial changes in the number of people who were saying those two words together. And that's going to be our basic approach here. So if it was just this one narrative about yachts and there happened to be a tweet about it, I don't think that would be that interesting. This is actually part of quite substantial effort by Storm 1516. We can think about who that might be. But here's a very nice diagram that Vignum, who's like a think tank inside the French Ministry of Defense, they wrote an amazing report about the Storm 1516 campaign. And they laid out basically the TTPs here. This is what we call a narrative laundering campaign. So in broad strokes, the way you can think about this is that someone invents a narrative basically from whole cloth. They then see that narrative strategically. They then layer references to these various seedings to sort of disguise where it's coming from and get word out more broadly and broadly. They then use paid accounts, in this case, both paid news accounts and paid social media influencers to amplify these messages, and then cite back to those amplifications, hoping, this is like buying a lottery ticket, hoping that someone in the mainstream will pick it up. And in the yacht case, their ticket paid off. Once, political actors in the United States are mentioning this narrative as evidence for why we should pursue one policy versus another, I don't think there's any question that that lottery ticket paid off big time. So we can get into the details of exactly how all of this layering happened, but that's not really the point of the presentation today. The point of the presentation today is that this yacht narrative, of course, build all this infrastructure. You don't just want to use it for one thing. In fact, as Vignum lays out, they used it for 70 things in basically the 2 years. This is based August 2023, which is where the first narrative that fits this agenda cropped up. And then this is through the beginning of January 2025. So you think about this as 18 months of output, all basically half of 2023, all of 2024, into the very start of 2025. And I'm not going to read all these, and I'm expecting you to read all these. What I'm illustrating here is that there were a lot of them. Okay, there were about 70, and there's a few past this point. I think when Vignum cut it off, they were up to sort of the beginning of 2025, a couple months into 2025. I'm not going to be talking about all these narratives today. Instead, today I'm going to focus on the specific narratives on this list, which contribute to what I think is an important kind of meta narrative that this campaign is trying to push. And that is what I'm going to call the Zelensky corruption meta narrative. So within these 70 specific narratives, there are 10 of them that have the exact same flavor. And the exact same flavor is the following: Vladimir Zelensky has bought something that he should not be able to afford. That's it. And the exact details of what he bought is what varies across these 10 narratives. So the first, I'm actually going to tell you all 10 of these, just so you have them all in your mind. The first one up here was August 2023, and it was Zelensky's mother-in-law bought a villa in Egypt. And again, think about this as there's documents of that, there's an eyewitness of that, there's all kinds of layering of this narrative of how it gets out. But that's the narrative. Zelensky's mother-in-law bought a villa. The second one, which is probably the second most famous one if you've seen this campaign at all, and that was Olena Zelenska spent $1 million in Cartier in New York City. And there was a witness of that, and that person gets interviewed, and there's receipts and whatnot. Okay. Vladimir Zelensky owns 2 yachts worth $75 million. That's the one I showed you already. That's this third one, November of 2023. Vladimir Zelensky acquired a villa that was formerly owned by Joseph Goebbels. Okay, so this is his second villa. Villa number 2. Okay. The fifth one is Zelensky acquired the former Charles III mansion. So now he's got 2 villas and a mansion and 2 yachts. The next one is Zelensky has acquired a casino in Cyprus. The next one is Olena Zelenska acquired a luxury car. It's a Bugatti specifically. Bugatti. The next one is Zelensky acquired singer Sting's villa in Italy. So now he's got another villa. Okay, so that's his third villa, I think. Zelensky acquired Adolf Hitler's parade car. Okay, now that's sort of pushing 2 ideas. It's about Nazism, but also about being able to afford expensive things that you shouldn't be able to afford. And the last one here is that he acquired a hotel in Courchevel. Okay, so again, there's no test about the details of these narratives, but I think you understand the sense in which they share something in common, and is that they're pushing, in some sense, this meta-narrative that Zelensky has too much money. He shouldn't be able to afford these things, and the fact that he is buying them is evidence that he's misappropriating and misusing funds. Okay, so what I'm showing you now is a timeline of every mention of the word Zelensky or Zelenska in various spellings on X by week. So the y-axis here is number of mentions by week, and the dotted vertical lines are the times where the first mention of each of those false narratives was released. So what you can see here is that throughout this whole period, on average, there's about 600,000 mentions of Zelensky on X every week. There are spikes when things happen. Those spikes don't really relate too much to these narratives being released. It's other things that are mostly driving the fact that people are talking about Zelensky a little bit or a lot on X. And here I'm showing you from July 2023, before the first narrative was introduced, all the way through January 2025, which is, several weeks after the last narrative that's in our set was released. Now, remember, throughout this period, there's lots of other narratives that Storm 1516 are putting out, but those narratives are not implicating Zelensky in corruption. They're involved with other things. We can talk about them during the Q&A if you're interested. Okay, so that's what this is showing us. Now, here's the research question. This is a big setup. Here's the research. Here's what I'm trying to understand. I'm saying, okay, did the Storm 1516 narrative laundering campaign targeting Vladimir Zelensky, and specifically the Zelensky is corrupt meta-narrative throughout 2023 and 4, increase the prominence of that meta-narrative in the public discourse around Zelensky? That's what I'm trying to understand. Did this intervention make that meta-narrative more prominent than it would have been in the absence of the intervention? And if so, how much more? I mean, I guess in principle it could be less, but there's that's not going to happen. So I really kind of have a one-sided hypothesis here, I think. Okay, so that's the question that we're trying to address. And now I want to step back a bit. So people have tried to measure the impact of influence operations I wouldn't say quite a bit, some. They've tried some. And I think that a couple of things we know pretty well, and this is not an exhaustive list of citations, this is just some, is that I do a pretty good job of building followings. So that I have some work in Misinformation Review about how the IRA built their followings. Zhang et al. Has some work about both about Russia and China. I think that at least good IOs are pretty good at picking up followers. But most of the evidence that looks at, hey, let's compare two people, one of whom received a message from one of these state-backed information operation and one of whom didn't, and who are otherwise very similar and lots of characteristics. And let's ask whether the people who received messages ended up with different political understandings or different beliefs or different voting intentions or whatever. Do we see much differences here? And I think, at least for the most careful of those investigations, we don't. We rarely see much difference between what you might consider the treated and control individuals. And so we may think that this is, pretty interesting and convincing evidence that although they do a lot and they pick up a relatively large following, they release a lot of messages, maybe those messages don't do much. Turns out that that's not just the case about state-backed influence operations. It's also true that people spend a lot of time trying to measure the impact of political influence in general, and the results are very similar. So like people who receive campaign literature and the people who don't, they sort of feel the same about stuff before or after whether they receive the campaign literature or not. They sort of vote the same. Most careful investigations of the effects of political campaigns finds, at least at this individual level, not much. Turns out that's not just about politics. Measuring the impact of marketing in general is hard. There's a large and growing literature about online marketing and advertising and comparing people who see the impression and don't see the impression, and we try to be very careful about doing those treatments, and we do find effects, but they're often teeny effects, and so you need huge data sets to even find them, and if you find them, they're small, and some economists have started thinking through like how many of these campaigns actually cover their costs, and the answer is often most of them don't. There's actually a really cool article in Econometrica that estimates that like 75% of these campaigns are definitely losers. Anyway, but all of these kind of have the same approach, which is that I want to focus in on individuals and contrast people that saw the message to the people who didn't see the message and see if they end up being different. And that's useful to know, obviously, but it requires some assumptions about people who didn't see the message. And so let's go back to the IRA case. So, sorry, I don't know my audience for sure. So when I say IRA, I mean the Internet Research Agency. So this is probably the most famous of all of the state-backed online coordinated influence campaigns. And a lot of work has tried to look at people who got hit by their messaging during the 2016 presidential election and those that didn't, and don't see much difference in their behavior. But most of that work is very laser focused on, did a message that was posted by that campaign appear in my feed? That's the best version of this. And sort of implicit in that is, if it didn't, then I wasn't affected. Now, that's true for certain sorts of effects, certain sorts of methodologies of having an impact on the information space. But what if I told you that during the last month of the 2016 presidential election, the Internet Research Agency hardly released any messages of their own at all? Almost all of their behavior was retweeting. Almost all of their behavior was retweeting. And not only was almost all of their behavior retweeting, we can show that accounts that got retweeted by the IRA grew more followers in the weeks leading up to the election than those that didn't get retweeted by the IRA. Now there's a chance, anyway, that people who didn't see the message from the IRA may nevertheless be affected by the existence of the IRA because they saw messages from accounts that were more prominent because of the existence of the IRA. This is just a just so story in the context of the IRA, but what I'm trying to suggest to you is that just comparing people who saw the message and people who didn't see the message may be throwing away some substantial impacts that an influence operation could have. Now, in order to have that sort of substantial impact that I'm talking about, this can't be something that's a niche thing happening in one little corner of the internet for this sort of spillover to really happen in any substantial way. And so what I want to argue for today is sometimes those spillovers can be big. So here's our approach. Rather than looking at individuals and having a treated individual and a control individual, instead I'm going to do everything at the narrative time level. And so what I want, the counterfactual I want you to have in mind is not what if I hadn't seen a message from Storm 1516. Instead, the counterfactual I want you to have in mind is what would the conversation around Zelensky have been like if Storm 1560 had never pushed this narrative at all? Obviously, we can't observe the counterfactual world. We can't see what would have happened if Storm 1516 had never pushed this narrative at all. But I'm going to argue for you that what the conversation around Zelensky looked like 2 days before they pushed the message is a pretty good proxy for what the conversation would have looked like if they hadn't pushed the message in the first place. So that's going to be our strategy, is basically we're going to use the exact timing of these message releases in order to convince you that they did something to the conversation around Zelensky. Okay. Now, there's disadvantages to this. So one advantage is that you'll be able to find that sort of general equilibrium effect. The disadvantage, of course, is it doesn't tell you anything at all about mechanisms. Right? All I can see is that things changed, and getting down into exactly how they changed and how those messages work, I can't do any of that. Okay. And so, this is a piece of evidence that I hope is useful. So here we go. Here's our 10 narratives. I want to tell you what each of these graphs show. And basically, what I'm doing is that I am just literally asking how many times in each week do people say the word here in the top left, Zelensky and Villa. That's it. I want Zelensky and all the variants of Zelensky and the word Villa. And I'm just going to count each week how many times those things were said. And I'm going to allow a break in this time series when the campaign released, when the first tweet of the narrative was released by the campaign. So in this upper left image, what you're seeing is low levels of the combination of those two terms until the week that the first Zelensky-Villa narrative came out, and then a huge jump that week, 40,000 messages that said Zelensky and Villa, and then that persisted a little bit in the next week, and then it sort of went away. Now, you may be wondering about this jump, but then you'll remember there were lots of Villas. And so Zelensky Villa is going to come up again, okay? So this first jump is that first Villa, okay? This one down here is Cartier. Can you see my pointer? I can. You can? Yes, good.
Yes.
So the second one here is Cartier. So this is the combination of the word Zelensky and the word Cartier. Literally, that's it. Just Cartier, okay? Big jump the week it came out. This is Yacht. That jump didn't happen the week it came out. There's a little jump the week it came out. This is literally Zelensky and Yacht. I just want the word Yacht. Okay, if this came back, we'll think about why it came back. I'll give you a hint. It has something to do with J.D. Vance saying that word. Okay. There's the second Villa. There's Highgrove House. There's him buying a casino. There's Bugatti. There's Sting. Okay. Turns out that I didn't want to use Villa again because sometimes I talk about it as Villa, sometimes I talk about it as Vineyard. So I just use Sting. I think we missed a bunch of messages here. These numbers are small. That's one thing I want to highlight. It's like some of these numbers are giant, like Bugatti, 120,000. Some of them are small, 1,500. It doesn't really, at least the way I'm measuring it, I don't see much evidence of that Sting narrative breaking through. Hitler, resort. Okay. So as you can say, in every one of these cases, there was a substantial increase in the combination of those words at the time that the narrative was released. Okay, fine. So what I'm going to show you now is the whole timeline. So this is what I'm going to show you now is the fraction of messages that included one of those narrative relevant keywords. So we can say Bugatti or Cartier or yachts or whatever. So it's all of them. Okay, I'm putting all of them together here. And the reason this thing runs from 0 to 0.3 is because this is the number of messages that say Zelensky and narrative keyword divided by the number of messages that say Zelensky. And so this is going to be pinned down between 0 and 1. Okay, and I'm showing you here the dashed lines for when the narrative is released. And you can see that basically every dashed line has a spike after it. these spikes are happening every time right after the thing. This is just another way to see that. But here it's scaled. Like those were all kinds of different scales. This is scaled by the total conversation around Zelensky. Okay, so this is all graphical. So what about econometrics? So this is going to be our econometric approach. It's dead simple. We're interested in running the following simple regression. We have 10 narratives. So I is going to be narratives, 1 through 10. We're going to count shares by week. And so we're going to look at the 4 weeks before the narrative come out. We're going to look at the week the narrative came out, and then we're going to look at the 4 weeks after the narrative came out. So for every narrative, we have 9 observations. Okay, 4 weeks before the week it came out, 4 weeks after. YIT is just what I described there, the share of the discourse that involved the narrative, the narrative relevant keywords. I'm going to have narrative specific fixed effects. That's basically saying that, people may just be talking about Zelensky and yacht at different levels even before the narrative comes out than they are when the narrative comes out. So I'm going to let that basically base rate of conversation vary across narratives. And then what we're really interested in is BJ, which is how much more people are saying that, how much more people are saying the narrative relevant keyword in the week the narrative went out, as in the case of B0, and the week after the narrative came out, in the case of B1, etc. I'm just going to see if it dies out or if it stays high or what. Okay, so that's our econometric strategy. It's literally that. It's basically diff and diff, but it's not quite diff and diff. And the reason it's not quite diff and diff is because there's not exactly a control group. I could run all of this where I controlled for like Zelensky and a throwaway term, but that's literally just going to be constant throughout this whole thing. We can talk a little bit about what that would do. All it really does in this context is add noise. Okay, so I'm going to run that regression. And here's what the results are of that regression. The base rate is basically none. People don't say Zelensky yacht. They don't say Zelensky Cartier. They don't say Zelensky Bugatti until the narrative is introduced. But the week that the narrative is introduced, it becomes basically 8% of the conversation. So in the week the narrative is introduced, the share of the narrative of the whole conversation about Vladimir Zelensky that involves that narrative jumps to about 8%. That mostly dies out by the second week, but it remains statistically significant at 1%. So there is 1% of the total conversation is about the narrative in the week. Not that the narrative is released, but 8 days plus after the narrative is released. And then things become difficult to measure and certainly no evidence of a big effect. So, I can't reject that those two numbers are the same in the test because that number is difficult to estimate. Okay, so that's narrative share. Now, I'm not actually interested in whether they talk about Zelensky and Bugatti. What I'm actually interested in is whether they talk about Zelensky being corrupt. And so what we want to do is we want to measure, hey, what share of the conversation about Zelensky is about Zelensky being corrupt? So for that, we use an LLM. So we basically showed 40,000 random messages about Zelensky over that whole period to an LLM, and we asked it the following question, hey, I'm going to provide you with a social media post. It can express one of the following ideas. It can either insinuate or explicitly state that Zelensky or Zelenska is financially corrupt or benefits from financial corruption. It can fact check or debunk or disagree with allegations of financial corruption. So one way these narratives could show up is it could all be people fact checking the narrative. Okay, so we want to make sure we don't count that as people talking about corruption. Although from an agenda setting perspective, that's still people talking about corruption. And so you may still, as an influencer, I may still think about fact checking as a win, but it's not as big of a win as being like, this guy's corrupt. And then, of course, a lot of these messages are going to have nothing to do with corruption. And so the third one is neither of the above. So it could be corruption-related discussion, but about people that are not Zelensky. Or it could be just general discussion about Zelensky, him being bad. All of that is all going to show up in other. Okay, so that's what we asked GPT-4 to do. And I'll show you here the confusion matrix. Of course, we had some humans code the same thing. Basically, if the LLM says it's about corruption, humans agree 88% of the time. If the LLM says it's fact-checking, humans agree 82% of the time. If the LLM says it's about none of the above, humans agree 85% of the time. So it's not great. It's not great, but it's not terrible. We can think through taking that into account and getting our standard errors right, but you'll see a much difference. Overall, here's the coded shares. So just for this whole data set, those 40,000 observation, about 10% were implying that Zelensky was corrupt. Almost none of them were debunking. 0.3% were debunking allegations of corruption. And then, of course, 90%, the remaining 90% were not related to corruption at all, or not related to Zelensky being corrupt. Okay. So we think this is good enough, so we're going to use it. And so now what I'm showing you is not keyword stuff at all. It's literally the share of the posts about Zelensky that week that were implicating corruption. As you can see, it's kind of all over the place. If you squint, there are spikes after the dotted lines, but there are spikes other places too. Okay. But this is just sort of giving you a sense of what it looks like over time. And then we're going to run the regression. And it's the same regression we ran before. But the dependent variable now is about this meta-narrative, the meta-narrative share. So I'm going to put them here next to each other. So this is the one I showed you before, the narrative share. This is the corruption share. So it's sort of the meta, I should have called this the meta-narrative share. Base rate's about 10%, as you know. The week in which a narrative was introduced, that jumps from about 10% to about 17%, 17.5%. So this total change in the percentage point change is very similar to the percentage point change for the very targeted narrative things. But it goes away. It's really just in that introduction week. By the week after that, it's gone. Okay, so we see the conversation changing, but just in the week in which the narrative is introduced. Super. I think there is a takeaway in addition to that. So I think the big takeaway here is that this is one way I could have gotten the narrative results would be if there's really no change in people talking about Zelensky being corrupt, but they're just talking about the scandal of the day. And so when the narratives introduced about yachts introduced, they talk about yachts. When the narrative about Cartier is introduced, they talk about Cartier. And when no narrative is introduced, they talk about some other scandal that's not one of the narratives, but there's really no change in how much they talk about corruption. It's basically what flavor of corruption they talk about. Turns out that's not the right answer. The introduction of these specific corrupt narratives increased the overall corruption discussion, not just the particular flavor that they're talking about. Okay, so it's not like crowding out a lot of other corruption discussion, which is what you might worry about. Okay. The last thing I'm going to talk about is not about X at all, but is instead about Google search. So it could be that people are talking about corruption, but no one's really being convinced of anything. I don't have surveys. And so what I'm going to show you instead is whether it may have raised questions in people's minds about Zelensky being corrupt. And the way I'm going to do that is that I'm basically going to find the Google search trends for Zelensky plus narrative word divided by the Google search trend the Google search trend score for Zelensky just by himself. And I'm going to do the ratio of those two things. So it's basically relative to how much people are searching about Zelensky, how much are people searching for Zelensky and yacht. Okay. So this is similar, but not identical to my narrative share. But I'm still going to call it Google trend share. And what you see here is, here's our dotted lines. Again, something's going on in the dotted lines. But, they're not all the same. Is this statistically significant? We'll see. We got to run the regression. And so we'll run the regression, the exact same regression as before. I put them all up here just so we have them all in front of us. And what do we see? We see in the week that the narrative is introduced, people search amongst all searches for Zelensky, the fraction of searches that involve the narrative goes up 6 percentage points. Basically, again, before the narrative is introduced, nobody's searching for Zelensky yacht. But then once the narrative is introduced, people start searching for Zelensky yacht about 6% of the time. And that persists, not just in the week the narrative is introduced, but people are also searching for Zelensky yacht in the next week and in the next week. So although the conversation about Zelensky yacht pretty much disappears on X by 2 weeks on, it's still showing up in Google search trends. Okay, so people are still wondering what's up with Zelensky and that yacht, okay, or Bugatti or Cartier or whatever. Okay. So let me sum up. So here's what I think I've demonstrated. that that the Storm 1516 intervention on the conversation around Zelensky resulted in about an 8 percentage point bump in the fraction of the conversation that related to those specific narratives, at least in the week that those narratives were introduced. That didn't persist much. There was like a 1% bump in the week after, but basically by then it was gone. That's not fact checking. There's basically none of this conversation is fact checking. These are people talking about the corruption narrative itself. That's true both for the specific narratives, but it doesn't crowd out other corruption discussion. Instead, it increases the share of the discussion around Zelensky that's about corruption. That spills over into Google search, both in the week of introduction, about 6 percentage points, but it's more persistent in Google search than it is on X. There is quite a bit of variation. I don't know, we don't really have power, but you can basically squint at these and see that the bump was bigger in some weeks than it was in others. The bump was bigger in some narratives than it was for others. Now, we don't know why, or we don't know if there wasn't much else to say about Zelensky that week, and that's why it's a big share, or if this narrative was particularly attractive. We don't know. But there is quite a bit of variation. But I would also add, it's not like it stopped working later on. Like, these bumps are not, there's no trend in these. It's not like it quits working I mean, maybe these last two are, we're just, we got n equal to 2 here. So like, I wouldn't do a lot with it, but clearly there are still effects even there. But I will say, you may worry that this is not very big or very persistent. So let me suggest 2 reasons why you should be interested. One is that 8% is huge. So 8% of the entire conversation around some very prominent world leader is big. That is big. Okay. If a brand, if they could change 10% of the conversation around their brand, that would be worth millions and millions and millions. The second is that although any individual narrative doesn't persist very long, I showed you 10 over 18 months, but I only picked those 10 because they all had sort of the same flavor to them. It doesn't persist, that individual narrative doesn't persist very long, but I got 10 of them over 75 weeks. So that's already like a bump in 10 over 75% of the time. And there's also 60 other things that Storm 1516 are pushing over this period that I didn't look at. But I don't think we have any reason to believe that impact would be small. I need to have multiple interventions in the same sort of narratives in order to do this analysis. I can't tell you how big they are in those other 60, but the fact that they're big here means that maybe we should worry about those other 60 too. Let me stop there. That was a lot. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, but I can pop it back up if it's convenient for looking at things. And then I'm happy to take questions. There's a lot of hands. I'm going to make Caitlin choose. Oh, you get your hand up, or are you clapping?
Oh, that was clapping, but I think Oscar
clapping.
lost his hand.
Okay, sorry.
I'll let him take it away since he's one of the grad student hosts.
Hello. Yeah, I want to take advantage of this. Yeah, thank you. Great presentation. Super interesting. And I love the fact that this is a different way to measure like how IOs affect about like how the narratives get affected. So I was gonna ask you a question about like okay, you're looking at the narratives and you looked at some variables, how they changed like over 1 week, 2 weeks. And it not doesn't have to be only like that narrative specific, but maybe something overall might be changing. And the next slide is show that is like actually happening. So one question I have is, have you also checked like the stance towards Zelensky in general, like feeling emotions that are involved in?
I did Go ahead, finish your question.
I have another question, but yeah, I can just wait. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, so the closest thing we did to this is that at the same time that we did this, what share of the conversation is about of the Zelensky conversation is about corruption. We just did a basic sentiment and emotion analysis there. We didn't find anything. So there's no evidence of a change in like anger in Zelensky or positivity in Zelensky. Now, I'm going to lay my cards on the table. I don't like those or trust them very much. I don't think, some of these people are happy that there's even more evidence that Zelensky's corrupt because they've been suspicious of Zelensky from the start. And look how smart I am now that we show that Zelensky's corrupt. I mean, I don't know what to do with sentiment in this context. I think that there are lots of situations. Let me not poo-poo sentiment in general. I think there are a lot of situations where it makes sense. Here, it's not clear to me which way I would even expect it to go. Like what sort of sentiment impact is Store 1516 trying to have? I don't know.
Yeah, exactly. Another question I had was also, so we know that Zelensky has been a political person in the first place for the last 5, 6 years at least since the war has started.
Of course.
In usually in opinion dynamics, the area of research, people sometimes even explain how opinions are in quantum terms. Like before you observe the opinion, it could be supportive or opposing. So I
What do
was
you mean like quantum mechanics?
yeah,
They
yeah,
don't know whether it's positive or negative until they look. That's
yeah.
interesting. Okay.
So my question was, yeah, Zelensky has been out there and he has been well known. So maybe there is this chance of people already uh settled down their ideas and their feelings towards Zelensky. So I was wondering if have you ever considered doing this research for someone who was not political in the first place, for years, so that once a narrative is being played out for that person, it changes the way people look at that person. So today, if Vasika gets some narrative in Twitter, people start talking about her in a in a positive light, and it happens to me in a negative light, how it changes the track of.
Right. So so imagine that we have a stream of people, and every period a new person appears, and they're going to form their political opinion about some issue. And these people are, some of them happen to appear in the week before one of these Zelensky narratives come out, and others happen to appear the week that one of these Zelensky narratives come out. And then I want to see if the people who, form their opinions in the week that the Zelensky narrative came out end up with different opinions. And maybe 6 months later, right? It's just like by happenstance they came up at various times. That's fascinating. I have no idea how I would find people who were forming their political opinions about Zelensky in the week before and after those things came out. Like I don't feel like I don't even have I would love week by week just sort of opinion on Zelensky. But I've never been able to find that. Even and that's going to be a mix of people who are forming new opinions and people who are just expressing their old opinions or changing their minds. Yeah, I always wanted that for this study. We've looked, and I haven't been able to find surveys that would do that. I would love if someone in the audience here could point me at one. How do people feel about just like a Zelensky barometer over this period would be amazing, but I can't.
I'm guessing there should be someone who's coming up new so that we can check them instead of Zelensky because it's too late.
Yeah, right. Everyone basically has an opinion on Zelensky. There are new people born every day. I'm serious. So I think that there is room to ask the question of when people reach a certain age, what narratives are prominent in the discourse at that sort of crystallizing time. I don't have the sort of developmental psychology expertise to do that study though.
Thank you so much.
Other questions? Rosika?
Yes, thank you so much for the presentation. It was really cool. I especially liked the fact that towards the end you also introduced the Google search trend, because that was kind of like one of the thoughts that I was having, is that, if you have these narratives that are having a spike and dying out really quickly, like what might be the long-term effect? And like one of the things that I was hoping you might be able to give some thoughts about is that Storm 1516 kind of used, at least in the example that you shared in this presentation, is that like there was some consistent flavor across these 10 examples across 75 weeks. And at each time, like there was a spike, and like we saw that, like after 1 week, it kind of trails off of X, but on Google search, it takes like 2 to 3 weeks to kind of trail off. I'm just kind of wondering what might be the long-term impact of that for people who are using social media, who are politically engaged on social media. And also like kind of like like pushing towards that thought of, like what is Storm 1516's like big goal here? If they have meticulously planned perhaps that like over 75 weeks they have these 10 examples about Zelensky being corrupt, and each one of those narratives has like some kind of impact. I'm just kind of wondering what might be the long-term goal that they're trying to
I
hit
mean,
here.
I think we see some evidence both of their goal and of the effectiveness at which they achieved it in the very first example I gave. I think that their goal is to change political opinions about Zelensky in order to undermine support for Ukraine in the international community. And so when JD Vance says, maybe we shouldn't send $1 million to Ukraine just so Zelensky can buy another yacht, I think that feels like a success. They basically put words in his mouth. He's now the vice president. Phil?
Hi. So first of all, thank you. Great presentation. And I also want to thank Caitlin and Rasika and Osgur for organizing and taking over from Matt, who's was doing this before. Matt is now our alumnus, and he has his hand up. So, and he never got to ask questions because he ran out of time when he was doing the presentation. So I should let him ask his question. And then if there is time, I can ask mine. So Matt, go.
Thank you, Phil. Yeah, great to be back and sitting on the other side of the screen here. And yeah, thank you for the great talk. I apologize, I missed the a little bit of the beginning. I'm on the West Coast, so the time is a little different, and I was a little slow this morning. So I wanted to ask a couple of clarifying questions that I may have missed.
Sure.
So as far as I can tell, you've like fully convinced me that there's like certainly sort of spikes in the conversation after they're sort of introducing these messages. I'm curious if you did any sort of analysis to look at sort of like, so this to me is sort of what I would expect, right? Because they're trying to push these messages, so they're going to be like flooding the zone. So was there any, did you look at, or it's probably difficult, but I'm curious if you looked at sort of like sort of user exposure. So if there's the people who are pushing the messages, and then are there other people taking it up? And then sort of to follow that, so I think the Google Trends is probably the closest thing that I saw that was sort of trying to get at this. But I wanted to ask how you were sort of like the specifics of measuring that share, given that Google Trends is already sort of a normalized metric. So just the math there was confusing for me.
Yeah. So let me say something about each of this. So the first is, I don't think I can disentangle people who are sharing this for motivated reasons and people who are sharing this out of interest and excitement and people who are sharing this out of curiosity. I think that's what I've given up. So when I move from the user to the narrative, I can't say much about that mix. All I can see is activity. Now I can say something about, hey, this isn't all, like we have several times at the end of this project gone back and sort of recollected these numbers. And this is not like all bots that are now suspended. Like these are real organic users. But what share that is, I can't tell you the answer to that because I don't have ground truth on who's real and who's not on the internet.
Sure.
And we know actually from reporting on Storm 15 and 16 that they did use some bots in the early amplification of this stuff. And so some of this is bots for sure. Now, bots don't Google search trend. And so it's not all bots. Someone was affected by this. That's then searching, did Zelensky really own a yacht? So that brings me to the second question, which was about how I did the Google search trend calculations. And the way I did that is that Google search trends is always normalized, but you can simultaneously do two searches, and they'll tell you the relative prominence of those two things. And so every time I search Zelensky and Zelensky yacht, and what I'm reporting is the ratio of those two things. So Zelensky is always, it's going to give a number for Zelensky, and it's going to give a number for Zelensky yacht, and then I'm going to take the ratio of.
Got it. Makes sense. Thank you.
And that's world. I did worldwide. I didn't say that, but you can choose the geography.
Got it. Okay. Cool,
Just
thank
because
you.
X is worldwide, and so I wanted to be as close as I could get to X.
Matt, did you have another question or?
No, he got them both. Those are the two pieces.
Actually,
Thanks.
Thank you. I was actually asking the same question about exposure. So same thing that Matt was asking. So it's kind of a comment more than a question, and you've partially answered it already. We know that the great majority of people using social media are consumers and not producers. The fraction of people who actually post anything at all is really tiny based on whatever data we've looked at. Most are silent observers or lurkers, as somebody calls them. So I think that, of course, the data that we have is about data production. So that's all we can do. Even a retweet is a production, although we can infer that they have seen something in order to retweet it. But most of the people who see something do not retweet it or reshare it. So I think that one of the big limitations of trying to quantify these things is that we have data on production, but which only gives us an estimate of a hugely underestimated. We are running out of time, so I'll just finish what I was saying. It was just a general comment rather than a question because you already answered. But my question is that, do we have any way at all to measure exposure? I know that some people do it by trying to look at the number of followers of the people who do the posts, but that's a really unsatisfactory approach because most followers do not necessarily see what is posted by someone. And also now we know that algorithms give less and less attention to the in-network content and more to out-of-network content based on recommendation algorithms. So I know that this is a big problem and I know that we don't have any solution, but I just wanted to put it on the table to remind us all how difficult it is to measure
So you were going to say something,
exposure.
Phil, if you could, you were going to say something about why Google.
Yeah, I was going to say that.
No,
it was not a criticism of the Google, but I was saying that unfortunately we cannot tell why people were Googling. One possibility was that some of those people were actually trying to fact check.
Sure.
And so it might be in some sense a positive sign. Instead of being like. So
but to me, it's evidence.
It's hard to disentangle, right?
To me, it's evidence of exposure, though, right? So
yes, absolutely.
The only reason I would fact check a thing is if I had been exposed to it in the first place.
Absolutely. And yeah, so anyway, so just some random thoughts, but I really appreciate your effort to try to find, some answers to this question about, impact, because I know that the few studies that try to measure impact always find that this impact is very small, but the methodology that allows us to measure this thing is somewhat unsatisfactory. Sometimes even a small effect could actually be huge, if you think of close elections, for example. So I really appreciate your efforts to try to look into this. So thank you.
Of course. Last minute. Okay. Well, thanks so much for the invite, and I'll keep my eye out for the other things that y'all are doing because I'm sure that they're interesting.
Yes, thank you so much, Patrick, for taking the time to speak to us. It was a super interesting conversation, and thank you everyone for joining. And our deepest apologies for the last-minute chaos that happened in here. But please keep track of our events page to see the future talks that we have. We have a few more coming up in this semester. And thank you, everyone. Have a good day.